All right, everyone. In this video, I am going to be going over some preliminaries for Susan Wolf's article, Meaning in Life and Why It Matters. And I'm just going to be making some further distinctions here that are important and aren't specifically covered in the article, but nevertheless are kind of working behind the scenes or sort of working beneath the surface here. Okay, so I admit that I find discussions and questions about meaning and things like that incredibly frustrating because part of the problem is just with obvious ambiguities with the way that we use language. So if my wife and I um, are watching playoff hockey, okay. And I say something like this. It's the Stanley Cup Finals. It's down to, the Detroit Red Wings and the Chicago Blackhawks in the Stanley Cup Finals. And the Red Wings are up 3 games to 1. Okay. And it's game five. And I say, oh, Detroit just won game five, right? So if Detroit is up 3 games to 1 and then they win game five, that means that they're up 4 games to 1, which means effectively that they are now the Stanley Cup champions. Okay. So I say, oh, wow, Detroit just won game five. And then my wife says, what does that mean? Okay. What does that mean that Detroit won game five? And I say, oh, well, that means they're the Stanley Cup champions. Okay, so my wife is not asking me in this instance what kind of sort of worth I sort of ascribe to this or anything. She's not asking me how I feel about it. She's not asking me about whether it's purposeful or anything like that. When she says, "What does that mean?" she's asking about the ramifications or the implications of the consequences of a given event or state of affairs that I have described to her. Or if I say to somebody, "Oh, the college board is taking a vote on," and I give them some 49 dash C, some the formal number of a given proposal, and somebody says, well, what does that mean? I'm going to describe for them the details of the actual proposal. We're not asking questions about worth or significance or anything like that. So when we're talking about meaning in life and things like that, we clearly are talking about significance and those kinds of things. But just given the ambiguity of the word meaning, that's part of the reason why these kinds of conversations are not abundantly clear. Okay, so to get at the one of the sort of the heart of the issue, here's one way of putting it. Is meaning something that is discovered, or is it something that is created? Another way of putting it is this: in order to find meaning, do we need to turn outward and look at the world itself, or do we need to turn inward and look at ourselves? Now, what this question is asking is whether meaning is something out there in the world, and we need to get on some path of discovery to find meaning just in the objective features of the world or the objective going ons in the world, or whether or not something is meaningful. Is it something that we need to look inside ourselves and ask, does this have meaning to us? Okay, or to myself. Now, because in other kinds of contexts, when we talk about meaning, we do understand that meaning is relative to a given community or a given group of individuals, or meaning is always directed for a group of individuals. So, y- you know, uh, my wife and I have certain cues with each other and with the children, various kinds of uh, sayings that we have in our family, and if somebody says, "Well, what does that mean?" They're going to ask about the particular context in which this kind of utterance came to be, and those kinds of things. And likewise, just when we think about language, what does a given word mean in a given natural language? Well, outside of the boundaries of that natural language, the word doesn't mean anything. The word is not applicable to anything independently of its application to a given group of individuals and the like. So we at least understand this linguistically, that talking about meaning as if it is some sort of absolute mind independent sort of phenomena or non sort of relative phenomena, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense linguistically. Well, maybe it doesn't make a whole lot of sense ethically either. Now, so one way of characterizing it is this. We often talk about meaning of life. What is the meaning of life? And we talk about it as if there can only be one, right? So if we're talking about meaning of life, it seems that meaning then is just kind of rooted in the objective facts of the world, and it's just something that we have to discover. So finding the meaning of life, that is something we need to be put on the path of discovering. We need to actually go out and investigate and find the meaning that's somehow embedded within the natural world itself. But if we're talking about meaning in life, that is something that we need to turn inward for. Now, and this is really important. Even if there is no meaning of life, objectively speaking, meaning that, meaning that, uh, which would imply that meaning is not something that is out there in the world which we just discover independently of our own input. Um, there does not have to be a meaning to life, or there does not have to be a meaning of life in order for there to be meaning in life. So we do have the freedom to make our own lives meaningful in certain kinds of ways, even if it turns out to be the case that life itself is, from an objective standpoint, meaningless. So there doesn't have to be objective meaning in life, or objective meaning to life, or objective meaning of life in order for our lives to be meaningful. So talking about the meaning of one's life as if there is some independent grand purpose to things, and it's our job to just discover what that grand purpose is, and we're just already set on that pathway, and we have no say in whether the pathway that we're on is meaningful to us or not. None of that needs to be the case in order for certain projects and activities and things like that to actually be meaningful. So if it doesn't make sense to talk about meaning independently of the individual, or the more importantly the community of individuals that are engaged in meaning making activities and those kinds of things, if it makes no sense to talk about those independently, to talk about some objective end path here that we're all just set on, and whether we know it or not. um, if that's not the right way to talk about meaning, then of course there can be meaning in life without there being a meaning to life or a meaning of life. Okay, now, but that doesn't mean that it's all relative and it's all subjective. So this is where I think an important distinction needs to be made here. There's an important distinction between talking about meaning and value or worth. All right. So in value theory, and in ethics, these are distinct concepts here. So if these are distinct concepts, that means that something can have value or worth even if it's not meaningful. So something can have value or worth, objectively speaking, even if it is not kind of subjectively meaningful. Now, certainly Susan Wolf would say that something can't be meaningful in a realistic sense. Something can't be meaningful if it also doesn't have objective value and worth. Now, other clearly other philosophers disagree. So if meaning is something that can be in one sense created, some philosophers want to go completely in the other direction and say, well, it's all completely subjective and it's all completely relative. Now, I myself agree with Susan Wolf here. I think that whether or not something has value or worth is largely objective, but whether or not something is meaningful is going to have both objective and subjective components. So, meaning requires the subjective component, but it needs to be based around things that actually have objective value or have objective worth. Now, what kind of subjective component is involved here? The subjective component, right, is the concern for whether an event or project or I put event in there twice. Sorry about that. Whether an event or project or activity should be the last one. Whether an event, project, or activity is meaningful does partially depend upon the individual. Now, the term I'm going to be using a lot here is this term of appropriation. So, whether or not a given event or project or activity um, is provides one with an opportunity for meaning making. I think that will depend upon largely whether that event or activity is the kind of thing that has some sort of objective value or objective worth. Now, but whether it's meaningful to the individual or a community largely depends upon the way that that project or activity or event is appropriated. Okay, so what it means to appropriate something is, in one sense, you appropriate something when you make a choice to find it meaningful, or you make a choice to create it in a way, create meaning for that. Now, but in other ways, it's not necessarily a choice to make something meaningful. Sometimes we experience things in our lives which are meaningful to us in ways that we largely do not control. So, in another sense, appropriating something is allowing oneself to be vulnerable or open to the kind of transformation that comes with certain events and certain activities or projects that we engage in. So, some of us, when we realize that we are making ourselves vulnerable, or we realize that things are sort of striking us to the core, and just really striking us to the very fabric of our being, it's easy to just shut ourselves off from whatever that is, to close off that openness, or to close off that vulnerability. Why? Because it's fearful. Now, and I think an important aspect of this, in just in our practical lives, involves grief. um, so, in many ways, grief is an emotion, but in many ways, grief involves an appropriate, holistic response as a whole person. So, grief is a process that you go through in the very entirety of your being, and grief involves the proper acknowledgement of the loss of something that you value, or the loss of something that has objective value. Now, and when you grieve something, when you grieve the loss of something, that means that as far as appropriating it in your life, as far as the openness that you have to whatever this thing is, whether it be a project or an individual, or given events and those kinds of things, when you grieve and you allow yourself to grieve, you are acknowledging the important role that that thing had in your life. And sometimes you can be surprised by your own grief. So sometimes the degree of grief that you are going through or expressing might be an indication that this thing mattered to you more than you initially thought that it did. So when we lose something and it causes grief, and we go through the process of grieving, that is an indication of how we have appropriated that thing in our life. Okay, so let me give you an example. I purchased this coffee mug from the Frothy Monkey. And there's one in Franklin, Tennessee, and there's one in Nashville, Tennessee. Um, I purchased this coffee mug several years ago when I visited both my brothers in Nashville. So my brother Josh lives in Nashville, my brother Jesse lives in Nashville, and I don't get to see them all that often. So anytime that I can see them, it matters. And we went to this coffee shop, the Frothy Monkey, and I purchased a coffee mug. So I have some sentimental attachment to this coffee mug. Not, I mean, it's just a regular coffee mug. Um, Not because necessarily of any features that the coffee mug has, but it represents a trip that I took. It's a memento or a souvenir that represents a time, a joyous time that I had with my brothers, who I'm very close with. Now, but if I broke this, I mean, it's replaceable, isn't it? I mean, so I've lost something that has a certain degree of meaning to me, in terms of what it represents. It represents a joyous time that I had with my brothers, but I've had other joyous times with my brothers, you know. Now, if it were a matter of I purchased this coffee mug the last time I saw my brothers, if something tragic were to happen to my brothers, this would have a lot more meaning for me than what it actually does. No, but given the actual nature of how things have gone in my life and things like that, this is replaceable. I would not be, I'd be upset, but would I be heartbroken, and would I have a significant amount of grief for losing this coffee mug? No, I would not. Why? It just doesn't have that kind of meaning to me. Now, other things in my life I've appropriated in much more significant ways. I mean, my relationship with my wife, my relationship with my children, my relationship with close friends and family members, those kinds of things. I there's an openness and a vulnerability that I exhibit towards individuals that I don't exhibit towards things like coffee mugs, but that just makes perfect sense. So, but in one way I do choose to allow myself to be open and vulnerable in and impacted in certain kinds of ways by these sorts of things, because I could resist and I could choose to just close myself off from people and events. I could choose to do that. But I still have this openness. But in another way, this kind of thing is not directly within my control. So here's one way of putting it. Whether or not something impacts me in a given way, I don't think that's largely within my control. I mean, I think having children is a perfect example of this. Um, the the first time I heard my son cry right after he was born, I could not emotionally. I'm gonna cry. Um, I could not emotionally, just in the very core of who I am, not allow myself, or I was just overwhelmed. Just the way it affected me. Any attempt that I would have made to just not allow myself to be affected by this, I mean, it wouldn't have worked anyways. Why? Because it was such a transforming event in my life. And the same when both of my daughters were born. But my son, my firstborn, my little buddy, uh, it changed everything. I went from not being a dad to being a dad in in the time span of an afternoon. Um, the kind of transformation that comes from those kinds of events in our life, we largely don't have any control over. But it's the difference between whether or not I have any control over how this event will impact me versus the degree of control that I have over whether or not I can cut myself off from that. So I think in many ways, the control we do have is the extent to which we can cut ourselves off. But I don't think we largely have control over whether initially we are affected or impacted by those kinds of things. I mean, so I mean, it wasn't hard emotionally and even spiritually to allow myself to go places when my son was born. That was not difficult. It would have been more difficult to cut myself off from those kinds of things. Um, but I do think through an act of will, we can seclude ourselves and isolate ourselves and avoid the kinds of things that will impact us in those kinds of ways. So we can, one way of putting it is this: we can thwart our own meaning making activities. So whether or not a given event or activity or project in my life has the opportunity or the propensity to be meaningful, or whether it provides me with an opportunity for making meaning in my life. Um, that is one thing. But whether or not we actually have the courage or we actually take the opportunity to hold on to those opportunities or not, that is largely up to us. That is largely a free choice that we need to make here. Okay. So I'll try not to cry for the rest of this video, but I make no promises at all. Okay, so I did indicate that I think there is an important difference between talking about meaning and talking about worth and talking about value. Okay, now, so I'm talking about value. To say that something has intrinsic value just means this. So something has intrinsic value if it is desirable for its own sake. Um, it's not desired as a means to anything else per se. It's desirable in its own right. It has certain kinds of features such that we ought to desire that kind of thing. Okay, now on the other hand, something has instrumental value just if it is desirable as a means to something else. So, whether or not something has intrinsic value is a matter of whether it's desirable for its own sake, and whether or not something has instrumental value is a matter of whether it is desirable as a means to something else. Okay. Now, but in this distinction between intrinsic value and instrumental value, there's a couple of pitfalls or mistakes that we can fall into. Okay, so mistake number one is this. Mistake number one is in thinking that something that has instrumental value is always less important than something that has intrinsic value. Okay, so having surgery clearly has instrumental value. So we don't get surgery just for the sake of having surgery. That would not make any sense at all. So having surgery has instrumental value. Now, going for a walk on the beach with one's romantic partner, that can have a high amount of intrinsic value, but it wouldn't make any sense to cancel a surgery so that you could go for a walk on the beach with your romantic partner. I mean, that would make it, especially if it's a rather important surgery, like it's a matter of life and death. You know, I would never call my doctor and say, "Hey, I need to postpone that surgery because I have to go for a walk on the beach." Okay, well, without the surgery, you won't be able to go for a walk on the beach anyways. That would be a mistake. Clearly, something having instrumental value can be more of an important matter or a pressing matter. So the idea that, well, we shouldn't be focusing our attention that which things on things that only or merely have instrumental value. You know, we need to focus our attention on things of value. I don't think that kind of reasoning can get off the ground. Something that has instrumental value can be more important than something which has intrinsic value. Okay, now the other mistake we can make is in thinking that somehow intrinsic value and instrumental value are mutually exclusive. The idea that, well, something either has intrinsic value or instrumental value, but not both. That is a mistake. It's a big mistake to think that these two things are mutually exclusive. So, for example, um, driving a motor vehicle has instrumental value to the extent it's a means from getting to point A to point B. Now, but it doesn't follow from that driving can't be an inherently enjoyable kind of activity. Sometimes you just feel like going for a drive, right? On a nice clear night, you roll the windows down and open the sunroof and just feel the wind on your face. Sometimes driving is just an enjoyable activity in its own right, or think of an artist. Um, if an artist is commissioned to do a piece, doing the piece has instrumental value. There's a deadline that needs to be met. It's a source of income. But if you're an artist as a profession, meaning that's how you make a living, it's both. So your art has instrumental value to the extent that it provides, income, and it provides you with the money you need to meet basic needs, or to provide yourself with basic necessities and other luxuries. But that doesn't mean that you're, performing art or creating something freely engaging in the creative process is not intrinsically valuable in its own right. Okay. Now, when we get into things like art and music, it does get a little complex because, okay, well, what if somebody is sacrificing their artistic values for the sake of making a profit? I'm not saying those concerns are not legitimate or anything like that, but the idea that if you're doing it for money, that in of itself means that it has no intrinsic artistic worth or value. I mean, I think that's absurd. I mean, so bear in mind, I'm getting paid to teach philosophy. And if I weren't getting paid, would I be doing it? Probably not. Why? Because I would be too busy doing some other kind of job. So, I mean, sometimes you do things just because you have to do them. That's what you're required to do as a member of a given profession. But just because something is required, that doesn't strip away any of its intrinsic value. So if it's required, it's instrumentally valuable to the extent you're accomplishing it to meet a goal or to meet some other kind of objective, fulfill an obligation. Now, but just because you're doing it to fulfill an obligation doesn't mean you're also doing it because it's an inherently enjoyable activity, or it is something that is a project of worth, or the project or activity itself has some kind of intrinsic value to it. Okay. Now, the other concern here is the difference between objective value and subjective value. Okay, so if something has objective value, that means that it ought to be desired or valued regardless of our desires or beliefs. So, regardless of whether or not we value it, it's the kind of thing which we ought to value. Why? Because it's the kind of thing which is worth our value attitudes. It's the kind of thing that has intrinsic worth to it. Um, Now, so to say that something has objective value means that its value is mind independent. Its value is not determined by our actual beliefs or desires or attitudes about it. Now, but something has subjective value if its value resides in the fact that we actually value it. So if something has objective value, its objective value does not require a valuer, individuals engaged in the act of valuing. But if something has subjective value, the subjective value of something does depend upon valuers. So there can't be subjective value independently of valuers, but there can be objective value independently of valuers. Okay, so how does this fall in with meaning? Okay, so if meaning, and whether or not there's meaning in life, or whether or not somebody's life is meaningful to them, if meaning does depend upon both the objective and the subjective, that means that there can't be real meaning in life without things that have objective value or worth, but there also can't be meaning in life without there being subjective valuers engaged in the act of valuing. All right. So, and again, even if something just has subjective value, that doesn't mean that it's not important. So, family mementos, you know, human artifacts that have been handed down from one generation to another, those things have subjective value, right? Those things have significance only because they're valued by individuals or valued by members of a certain kind of community. That is subject. Okay, So something can have a tremendous amount of subjective value, even if it has little to no objective value. And again, the idea that things that only have subjective value are somehow diminished by that fact, that no, not necessarily. Okay, there might be some way that something only having subjective value means that its value is diminished, but in other ways, overemphasizing the objective value of things is a mistake. Okay, so for example, so speaking of my son Desmond, who made me cry just a few minutes ago, one day he came home from kindergarten, and I was setting him up at the kitchen table to get ready to do homework and getting him a snack and all of that. And I was getting his books out and his homework folder. And in his homework folder, there was a folded up piece of paper. So I took it out and I unfolded it and it had nothing written on it. I just thought it was a scrap piece of paper, so I threw it away, right? And he came out of the bathroom and was really excited. He was like, "Daddy, I need to show you something." And I was like, "What is it, buddy?" And he started looking through his book bag. He's opening his books. He opened his homework folder, and he got this really weird, worried look on his face. And he said, "Where's my paper airplane?" And I went, "Uh, what?" And he said, "My paper airplane." He said, "My friend Jackson made it, and we were playing with it at recess, and we had a lot of fun. And he gave it to me. He said, 'Desmond, I want you to have it because we're friends.'" And I said, "Was it that folded up piece of paper?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "I'm sorry, buddy, I threw it away." Right? And what do you think I did immediately? I fished that thing out of the garbage and I gave it back to him. Now, it would be a mistake for me to look my son in the eye and say it's just paper and paper has little to no objective value. So that kind of thing. So paper is only valuable because we value it for certain reasons. So just get over it. It's just paper. No, it's not just paper. It was a gift, right? So how much objective value does this piece of paper have? Little to no objective value. But just because the paper has little to no objective value, that doesn't mean that I look my son in the eye and tell him to be more concerned with things that have objective value. It's just paper, son. No, it's not just paper. So, objectively, sure, it's just paper. Subjectively, it's much more than that. It is a gift that a friend of my son's gave him because he recognized that my son was enjoying playing with it. Now, and since that piece of paper has a tremendous amount of subjective value to my son, um, to the extent that I value my son and to the extent that I love my son, I'm morally required to act in certain ways towards that piece of paper. I can't rip it up in front of him or burn it. I would be harming my son. I would be traumatizing my son by doing that kind of thing. So demanding that my son get real and be more concerned with things in life that are objectively, that have objective value and get this idea of subjective value out of your head, that would be a mistake. That it would be a tremendous mistake for me to think that way. Okay? All right. So, yeah, this video is about half an hour long, so I will cut it off there. And then in the next video, we'll get to the actual heart of Susan Wolf's article. See you then.